The United States is the second-largest energy consumer in terms of total use in 2010. The U.S. ranks seventh in energy consumption per capita after Canada and a number of small nations. Not included is the significant amount of energy used overseas in the production of retail and industrial goods consumed in the U.S. The majority of this energy is derived from fossil fuels. In 2010, data showed 25% of the nation's energy came from petroleum, 22% from coal, and 22% from natural gas. Nuclear power supplied 8.4% and renewable energy supplied 8%, which was mainly from hydroelectric dams and biomass, but also included other renewable sources such as wind power, geothermal and solar energy. Energy consumption has increased at a faster rate than domestic energy production over the last 50 years in the U.S. This difference is now largely met through imports. According to the Energy Information Administration's statistics, the per capita energy consumption in the U.S. has been somewhat consistent from the 1970s to today. The average has been 334 million British thermal units per person from 1980 to 2010. One explanation suggested for this is that the energy required to produce the increase in U.S. consumption of manufactured equipment, cars, and other goods has been shifted to other countries producing and transporting those goods to the U.S. with a corresponding shift of greenhouse gases and pollution. In comparison, the world average has increased from 63.7 in 1980 to 75 million BTUs per person in 2008. On the other hand, U.S. offshoring of manufacturing is sometimes exaggerated. U.S. domestic manufacturing has grown by 50% since 1980. History. From its founding until the late 18th century, the United States was a largely agrarian country with abundant forests. During this period, energy consumption overwhelmingly focused on readily available firewood. Rapid industrialization of the economy, urbanization, and the growth of railroads led to increased use of coal, and by 1885 it had eclipsed wood as the nation's primary energy source. Coal remained dominant for the next 7 decades, but by 1950, it was surpassed in turn by both petroleum and natural gas. In 2007, coal consumption was the highest it has ever been, with coal mostly being used to generate electricity. Natural gas, which is cleaner burning and more easily transportable, has replaced coal as the preferred source of heating in homes, businesses and industrial furnaces. Although total energy use increased by approximately a factor of 50 between 1850 and 2000, energy use per capita increased only by a factor of 4. As of 2009, United States per capita energy use had declined to 7,075, 12% less than 2000, and through 2010 is at levels not seen since 1960s usage levels. At the beginning of the 20th century, petroleum was a minor resource used to manufacture lubricants and fuel for kerosene and oil lamps. 100 years later it had become the preeminent energy source for the U.S. and the rest of the world. This rise closely parallels the emergence of the automobile as a major force in American culture and the economy. While petroleum is also used as a source for plastics and other chemicals, and powers various industrial processes. Today 2/3 of oil consumption in the U.S. is in the form of its derived transportation fuels. Oil's unique qualities for transportation fuels in terms of energy content, cost of production, and speed of refueling all contributed to it being used over other fuels. In June 2010, the American Energy Innovation Council, a group which includes Bill Gates, of Microsoft, Jeffrey R. Immelt, chief executive of General Electric, and John Doerr, has urged the government to more than triple spending on energy research and development, to $16 billion a year. Mr. Gates endorsed the administration's goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 80% by 2050. but said that was not possible with today's technology or politicism. He said that the only way to find such disruptive new technology was to pour large sums of money at the problem. The group notes that the federal government spends less than $5 billion a year on energy research and development, not counting one-time stimulus projects. About $30 billion is spent annually on health research and more than $80 billion on military R&D. They advocate a jump in spending on basic energy research. U.S. CO2 emissions have dropped about 1% per year through greater efficiency and a sluggish economy since 2008. Current consumption. Primary energy use in the United States was 25,155 terawatt-hours and 82 terawatt-hours per million persons in 2009. Primary energy use was 1,100 terawatt-hours less in the U.S. than in China in 2009. Same year, the share of energy import in the U.S. was 26% of the primary energy use. The energy import declined California 22% and the annual CO2 emissions California 10% in 2009 compared to 2004. Consumption by sector. The U.S. Department of Energy tracks national energy consumption in 4 broad sectors: industrial, transportation, residential, and commercial. The industrial sector has long been the country's largest energy user, currently representing about 33% of the total. Next in importance is the transportation sector, followed by the residential and commercial sectors. Consumption by source. The breakdown of energy consumption by source is given here. U.S. primary energy consumption by source and sector in 2008 is tabled as following. Note: sum of components may not equal 100% due to independent rounding. Total primary consumption. Historical evolution in the U.S. until 2011. Total consumption until 2011 in MTOE. CAGR equals compound annual growth rate. Note: total energy includes coal, gas, oil, electricity, heat and biomass. Regional variation. Household energy use varies significantly across the United States. An average home in the Pacific region consumes 35% less energy than a home in the South Central region. Some of the regional differences can be explained by climate. The heavily populated coastal areas of the Pacific states experience generally mild winters and summers, reducing the need for both home heating and air conditioning. The warm, humid climates of the South Central and South Atlantic regions lead to higher electricity usage, while the cold winters experienced in the Northeast and North Central regions result in much higher consumption of natural gas and heating oil. The state with the lowest per capita energy use is New York, at 205 million BTU/year, and the highest is Wyoming, at slightly over 1 billion BTU/year. Other regional differences stem from energy efficiency measures taken at the local and state levels. California has some of the strictest environmental laws and building codes in the country, leading its per household energy consumption to be lower than all other states except Hawaii. The land use decisions of cities and towns also explain some of the regional differences in energy use. Townhouses are more energy efficient than single-family homes because less heat, for example, is wasted per person. Similarly, areas with more homes in a compact neighborhood encourage walking, biking and transit, thereby reducing transportation energy use. A 2011 U.S. EPA study found that multifamily homes in urban neighborhoods, with well-insulated buildings and fuel-efficient cars, can save more than 2/3 of the energy used by conventionally built single-family houses in suburban areas. Renewable energy. Renewable energy in the United States accounted for 13.2% of the domestically produced electricity in 2014, and 11.2% of total energy generation. As of 2014, more than 143,000 people work in the solar industry and 43 states deploy net metering, where energy utilities buy back excess power generated by solar arrays. Renewable energy reached a major milestone in the first quarter of 2011, when it contributed 11.7% of total U.S. energy production, surpassing energy production from nuclear power. 2011 was the first year since 1997 that renewables exceeded nuclear in the U.S. total energy production. Hydroelectric Power is currently the largest producer of renewable power in the U.S. It produced around 6.2% of the nation's total electricity in 2010, which was 60.2% of the total renewable power in the U.S. The United States is the fourth largest producer of hydroelectricity in the world after China, Canada and Brazil. The Grand Coulee Dam is the fifth largest hydroelectric power station in the world. U.S. wind power installed capacity now exceeds 65,000 megawatts and supplies 4% of the nation's electricity. Texas is firmly established as the leader in wind power development, followed by Iowa and California. The U.S. has some of the largest solar farms in the world. Solar Star is a 579-megawatt farm near Rosamond, California. The Desert Sunlight Solar Farm is a 550-megawatt solar power plant in Riverside County, California, and the Topaz Solar Farm, a 550-megawatt photovoltaic power plant, is in San Luis Obispo County, California. The Solar Thermal SEGS group of plants in the Mojave Desert has a total generating capacity of 354 megawatts. The Geysers in Northern California is the largest complex of geothermal energy production in the world. The development of renewable energy and efficient energy use marks a new era of energy exploration in the United States. According to President Barack Obama, oil, for most of the 20th century and the early part of the 21st century, the majority of energy consumed has been from oil. Fossil fuel provided 81% of the world's energy in 2009, with oil the largest contribution. The United States became a world power in the early 20th century as they increased development of oil production and influenced world oil reserves for growth in development. As the 20th century developed, petroleum gained increasing importance by providing heating and power to the commercial and industrial sectors. Oil was also used in transportation, first for railroads and later for motor vehicles. As automobiles became more affordable, demand for oil quickly rose. Since the rise of the automobile industry, oil price, demand, and production have all increased. From 1900 to 1980, fuel was directly correlated with gross national product. Oil shocks have often coincided with recessions, and the government has responded to oil shocks with a variety of methods. In the 1920s, oil prices were peaking and many commentators believed that oil supplies were running out. Congress was confronted by requests to augment supplies, so a generous depletion allowance was enacted for producers in 1926, which increased investment returns substantially. This change induced additional exploration activity, and subsequently the discovery of large new oil reservoirs. The next decade, the situation was reversed, with prices low and dropping. This led to demands for more orderly competition and set minimum oil prices. Rather than repealing the previous policies enacted in the 1920s, Congress enacted a price support system. Similar cycles have occurred in the 1950s and 1970s. price with the exception of one. Every U.S. recession since World War II experienced a sharp increase in the price of oil. This correlation strongly signifies the U.S. dependency of oil for the economy, as well as oil's importance in U.S. development for most of the time since the war. Many of the key cases of crude oil price increases in the post-war period were associated with political upheaval from oil-rich countries. Domestic production and consumption were outpaced by U.S. demand toward the end of the 1960s, and Middle Eastern nations gained a significant amount of political leverage in controlling prices based on the production. Price increases have been directly related to increased investment in subsequent production in oil. Following World War II, European reconstruction was the primary objective of the United States economy, and investment eventually rose after a long-term price increase at the end of the war. During the 1950s, there were strikes by oil workers, production restrictions imposed by the Texas Railroad Commission, as well as the Suez Crisis and Korean War, all creating steep price increases, with prices only falling after production was able to meet demand. Peak oil in the United States resulted in a definite decline of U.S. reserves and even more strikes by oil workers. Additional singular events such as the OPEC embargo, the rupture of the Trans-Arabian Pipeline, and Iranian nationalization of the oil industry led to further price increases that were never before seen. Each case was followed by a marked recession in the U.S. economy. In 2008, oil prices rose briefly to as high as $145 per barrel, and U.S. gasoline prices jumped from $1.37 to $2.37 per gallon in 2005, leading to a search for alternate sources, and by 2012, less than half of U.S. oil consumption was imported. However, as of January 2015, the price of oil has collapsed to around $50 per barrel. Consumption and production in the 20th century, oil production became of more value, as the U.S. industrialized and developed commercial transportation, such as railroads and motor vehicles. Furthermore, oil consumption also increased due to electricity. After electricity, oil became more important in commercial, manufacturing and residential sectors such as heating and cooking. Therefore, during this period, the growth of oil consumption indicates that the United States was becoming dependent on oil, and it aided the growth of the domestic oil industry. However, U.S. oil domestic production could not cover the growing demand in the U.S. market, which led the U.S. to look for a new supply internationally. U.S. consumption of oil increased 53% between 1915 and 1919, followed by another increase of 27% in 1920. The first shock of the transportation era occurred in 1920 and lasted for about a year. The shortage of oil devastated the entire West Coast with hour-long lines for gasoline, and in many places fuel was not available for at least a week. Finally, big production from Texas, California and Oklahoma took the shortage of oil away, causing oil prices to fall 40% between 1920 and 1926. The Great Depression in 1929 was a time with growing supply and falling demand, causing the price of oil to decrease about 66% from 1926 to 1931. Toward the end of World War II, the automotive era settled rapidly, and the U.S. demand of oil increased 12% between 1945 and 1947, while motor vehicle registrations increased by 22%. Around 1948, demand of oil exceeded supply of oil, leading the U.S. to start importing oil. Therefore, the U.S. quickly became a major importer of oil, instead of being the major exporter. In 1952, due to a strike by U.S. oil refinery workers, the United States and the United Kingdom cut 30% of fuel delivery to civilian flights, while Canada postponed all private flights. Until the 1960s, the price of oil was relatively stable and the world market could cover the excess demand of oil in the U.S. However, in 1973, the price of oil increased due to the Arab oil embargo against the U.S., following United States' support of Israel in the Yom Kippur War. During that time, Arab oil producers reduced production 4.4 mbd for 2 months, 7.5% of global output. During this time, people reduced their consumption of oil by turning down thermostats and carpooling to work, which together with the lower demand due to the 1973-75 recession, resulted in a reduction in oil consumption. After the crisis of 1973, price of oil increased again between 1979 and 1980 due to the Iranian Revolution. This crisis was related to political instability in a major oil exporting region. During this period, oil consumption decreased due to new efficiency. Cars at that time were developed, so less oil was required, and industrialization was also advanced to reduce the consumption of oil. This led to a decline in U.S. demand of oil and reduced the amount of international imports. The last energy crises in the U.S. occurred in 1990. This occurred because Iraq invaded Kuwait. Similar to the previous crisis, price of oil increased and oil consumption decreased, but by a smaller amount and had a smaller effect. In 2010, 70.5% of petroleum consumption in the U.S. was for transportation. Approximately two-thirds of transportation consumption was gasoline. Today, U.S. is still dependent on oil as oil is an important player socially, economically and politically. U.S. demand of oil is increasing exponentially, causing the U.S. to continue to rely on foreign countries. Policy regulation of the oil market has been a major player in oil history. Policies affect the market in a variety of ways, such as price, production, consumption, supply and demand. The oil market has a history of booms and troughs, which caused producers to demand government intervention. Many times this government involvement only made the situation worse, and many of the regulations were quickly ruled illegal and removed. Before World War II, many of the problems within the oil market were related to changing prices. During the 1920s, oil prices were beginning to peak, leading to fears of oil depletion. In response to these fears, during Coolidge's term, Congress enacted a depletion allowance to producers, which led to a surge of investment in the oil business and the discovery of many new, large oil reservoirs. The next decade consisted of falling prices due to the new investment and overproduction. The declining prices led producers to demand some form of price support system. One example of how prices were propped up was a pro-rationing order made by the Texas Railroad Commission, which restricted oil production and increased price. This order was soon ruled illegal by federal district court in 1931. The 1930s was the beginning of large federal intervention in the oil industry and began with the creation of the National Industrial Recovery Act. In 1933, this act allowed for natural price competition, instead of agreements between the major producers. However, this act was ruled unconstitutional in 1934. While the time before World War II was filled with issues regarding price, the post-war era consisted of increasing oil imports, partly due to the price support established during the 1920s and 1930s. The artificially high domestic prices led to a surge of imports from lower-priced foreign producers. In 1955, a clause was added to the Reciprocal Trade Act amendments which gave the president the power to limit imports of a specific commodity, if that particular commodity was harmful to the security of the nation. This clause allowed Eisenhower to enact oil import quotas in 1959, which ultimately caused international oil prices to decline. These import quotas restricted international oil companies from the U.S. market, and led them to form OPEC. During the 1970s, Richard Nixon put in place many phases of price controls. After many new regulations that altered the original price control system, President Carter eventually began removing these controls in 1979. During the Carter administration, in response to an energy crisis and hostile Iranian and Soviet Union relations, President Jimmy Carter announced the Carter Doctrine, which declared that any interference with U.S. interests in the Persian Gulf would be considered an attack on U.S. vital interests. Ronald Reagan later expanded this doctrine. Since the 1990s, the oil market has been free of most regulations.